Right. So in June 23, variant 22, question 2A, it's about consumer surplus, and it's about how consumer and producer surplus is going to have an impact if something changes. In fact, this is one of the questions, if I look at it correctly, almost like this अभी नवंबर के अंदर ये question आया है, November 25. Uh, the first part is pretty much the same. The second part has a slight variation, but unfortunately, kids took it in a very strange way, the way they answered. ये वाला तो फिर भी चलो आसान है, they haven't created the vagueness in it. So, question has two parts in it. Yeah, there are two parts to the question. The first part is that you have to make a diagram. Okay, you have to make a diagram and you have to explain what is consumer surplus and what is producer surplus. And then you have this is a simple one. You should get at least 3 marks for this one, straightforward. And the next part is the troubled one, that consider whether a rise in the price of product because of higher cost of production is likely to always reduce the consumer surplus. Is it always going to reduce the consumer surplus? I remember there was a problem with this one also, even in the checking wala aspect. Um, like I've mentioned before, the marking scheme is made after the paper is done. First 3 marks is for knowledge and understanding, then the 3 mark is for your analysis, and the 3 mark is for evaluation. जो अभी जून के अंदर क्वेश्चन आया था, नवंबर में सॉरी 25 के अंदर, everything is exactly the same except for is likely to always reduce the consumer surplus ki jagah. All they did was they said um, how the producers are going to get affected. Okay. At least for this part, पहले part के अंदर explain with the help of a diagram uh, what is meant by consumer surplus and producer surplus. So you have to make a diagram. And in your diagram, your labels are the first thing that we're going to look at. I think इसके अंदर एक diagram का एक mark होगा, okay? But not necessarily. हो सकता है कि they might decide to give consumer surplus के लिए एक separate mark और producer surplus के लिए एक separate mark. So what we'll do is we'll make sure our labels are all there, and I would make sure that I label in my diagram that this is my consumer surplus and this right here is my producer surplus. अभी जो नवंबर में आया उसके अंदर if you're not writing consumer and producer surplus over here, you're not getting 1 mark for the diagram that we left with. In fact, अगर आपने सिर्फ consumer surplus mark कर लिया and producer mark नहीं किया, the mark is gone. You could have made it separately also, एक individual demand curve बना के, एक individual supply curve बना के, and you could have shown it. We had no issues as long as we can see what it is. उसके बाद, it is important for us to give a definition. All sorts of definitions can come, lekin I would like you to stick to the basic definitions. Consumer surplus क्या होता है? Consumer surplus is the difference. Difference between what? It is the difference between the price consumer is willing and able to pay and the price they actually pay. Understood? That is your definition. Now, keywords, it's about a difference between willing and what they actual. ये आइडिया मेरा बिल्कुल क्लियर होना चाहिए. Kids go on a limb here and they also explain that it's the area below the demand curve, above the price. You want to do that, you do that, no problem whatsoever. In fact, I would recommend you do that also. But जो आपकी basic definition है, you must write your basic definitions. Then in terms of, if you don't write, by the way, the difference, then your definition is too vague. If you're saying consumer surplus is the price consumer is willing to pay and the price they actually pay, what does that mean? It's the difference, one minus the other, whatever is left over, that is the consumer surplus. Similarly, producer surplus is the difference between the price producer in this case, producer is willing and able to charge, and the price they actually charge. Now, I would not mind कि अगर आप actual charge की जगह market price लिख लें या so I would accept that. I have accepted that. So, that is completely acceptable also. You should get 3 marks. If you want to mention it's the area above the supply curve, below the market price, it's perfectly fine also. ठीक है? I would want to avoid saying equilibrium price. I would rather say market price. And there's a reason क्योंकि जब हम minimum maximum price control करेंगे तो उसके अंदर actually equilibrium price नहीं होती है. मार्केट प्राइस जो होती है ना वो मिनिमम और मैक्सिमम की बेसिस पे डिसाइड होती है तो इट्स नॉट नेसेसरली इक्विलिब्रियम प्राइस. ऑलराइट, सो वी वांट टू से मार्केट प्राइस या द प्राइस दे एक्चुअली चार्ज. यू शुड गेट अबाउट 3 marks फॉर दिस वन. उसके बाद and consider whether a rise in the price of a product because of higher cost of production is likely to always reduce the consumer surplus. Okay, number one, डायग्राम बनेगा, एक और डायग्राम बनेगा. इनफैक्ट हैव दे आस्क्ड फॉर अ डायग्राम? आई डोंट थिंक सो. डायग्राम उन्होंने किस चीज का मांगा था? उन्होंने सिर्फ बोला था डायग्राम के थ्रू कंज्यूमर प्रोड्यूसर सरप्लस की बात करें. लेकिन there are two diagrams which are necessary in this question. तो प्लीज बी माइंडफुल ऑफ दैट. अभी भी जो नवंबर में आया था उन्होंने एग्जैक्टली यही काम किया. Kids who drew the diagram, they got 1 mark for it. क्योंकि क्वेश्चन में क्या है? क्वेश्चन के अंदर उन्होंने लिखा है and consider whether a rise in the price of a product because of higher cost of production is likely to always reduce consumer surplus. So the diagram is, जब there is a rise in the cost of production, your supply curve needs to shift upwards like this, right? और जब ये होगा तो प्राइस राइज होगी. ऑलराइट, उसके बाद क्या होगा? तो प्राइस हैज रिजन, क्वांटिटी हैज फॉलन. तो इसी डायग्राम के अंदर आई थिंक इट वुड बी अ वाइज आइडिया टू लेबल दिस डायग्राम इन टर्म्स ऑफ सरप्लसेस. I hope you guys have slight idea about what surplus really is. Um, if this was your original consumer surplus, so I would mark it as area 1, 2, and 3, and I would show in my diagram and I will do my explanation that in this instance, what is happening in my diagram, that due to the higher cost of production, supply fell and it caused the price to rise, and that led to fall in quantity demanded. Okay, so all of that is already there in the question, nothing new about it. But उसकी वजह से consumer surplus को क्या होता है? So I would mention that original price के ऊपर, in fact original equilibrium के ऊपर, the original consumer surplus area was 1 plus 2 plus 3, and now after the price has risen, the new consumer surplus is just area 1 because price has gone up. right? Price has gone up, and now you're left with this area as consumer surplus. If you could see, a second, there's a lag here. Yeah, this area one here is the consumer surplus. So just to repeat myself, consumer surplus hota kya hai? All the time what happens is consumers are willing to pay a higher price for something, obviously, in which they feel that they can get much higher utility from that consuming of that good. They're willing to pay a much higher price for it, but the price they're paying is lower. For example, if somebody really likes a particular singer and they're such a big fanatics that they're willing to pay like 30,000 for the tickets, but obviously the concert organizers and they've decided that they want to charge 15,000 for it or maybe 10,000 for it. So people who are willing to pay 30,000 only ends up paying 10,000. तो उनको सरप्लस हो गया सरप्लस मतलब उनको एक बेनिफिट हो गया that they were willing to pay higher prices but they ended up paying lesser price. Similarly, when your original price was P0, everything below the demand curve represented consumer surplus. And when supply curve shifted to the left and prices went up, consumer surplus fell down. Because they've used the word higher cost of production, we must shift the supply curve to the left. I am telling you, I have seen questions, answers, जिसके अंदर kids are doing this. They're not showing the supply curves. In fact, ये वाला supply curve भी उन्होंने नहीं दिखाया. And all they did was they just ये SO भी जो है, they basically haven't done SO in their diagram. And they've just made the demand curve to show कि देखें price ऊपर जाएगी तो किस तरीके से quantity गिर जाएगी and only area one will be the new consumer surplus. But remember, if you're not shifting the supply curves, you're not showing the supply curves and showing because of the higher, there is a problem in your answer. Now, the problem that we had with the question was this. Question said, because of the higher cost of production, is it likely to always reduce the consumer surplus? Well, the thing is, if you look at the diagram, anytime supply curve shifts to the left and the prices go up, you will always have a reduction in consumer surplus. But really, what they want a discussion on is how about if the demand curve is elastic or inelastic? What is going to happen in that case? So, in my opinion, a good diagram to deal with that particular situation is this one. अगर आप डायग्राम के थ्रू भी ये बात को ना समझाएं ना तो it's perfectly fine because जो relevant diagrams say they are there. But I just want to prove my idea. Um, Something like this. Let me take a point at first in my diagram, and I'll show you why I'm doing that. I just want to prove what happens to consumer surplus when price rises. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make the price go up here. Okay. Now, how this particular price change is going to have an impact on an inelastic demand curve. So firstly, we should know how to make an inelastic demand curve, right? It's a steep one. और इसी diagram के अंदर I will also place in an elastic demand curve. Okay? And I'll tell you why I'm doing this. Let's call it D1. Okay? Now, what has happened is that the price has risen. So when price has risen, in case of elastic demand curve, we see a very large fall. ये मेरा price elastic demand curve है. And if you observe in the inelastic wale case mein, there's a very, very small fall in the quantity. This is for the inelastic case. All right. Now, the thing, I'll try to explain it also. So let me just duplicate this for a second. What I'm trying to, you don't need to make these diagrams, by the way. Okay, this is just for explanation purpose as to what's going to happen. What I want to show is in my first diagram, when the demand curve was elastic and the price went up, elastic के case में, because of the rise in the price, my consumer surplus loss is this. Because the price went up, तो original consumer surplus क्या था? Let me highlight it. The original consumer surplus is 1, 2, and 3. Okay, that's your original consumer surplus before the price rose. And the price was PO, below the demand curve, above the price. 1, 2, 3 is consumer surplus. Okay. When the price rises, area 2 and 3 are lost and only area 1 is left. So there's a big fall in consumer surplus. Lekin if you notice in the case of inelastic case mein, your consumer surplus is everything below the demand curve and above the market price. All of this is consumer surplus. Because I just extended my demand curve, by the way, that this is the trajectory it has. We have our consumer surplus. This entire area is our consumer surplus. All right. And when the price rose, we have a loss in consumer surplus, which is this small area right here. Okay. तो हमने क्या शो किया हमारे इस दो डायग्राम्स के अंदर, इफ यू लुक एट, जब मैं इनइलास्टिक को भी इसमें इंक्लूड कर लेता हूं, तो दिस इज व्हाट माय न्यू कंज्यूमर सरप्लस बेसिकली रिप्रेजेंट्स. तो slightly, if I was to highlight this, let me change the highlighter. If I was to highlight, if I compare elastic versus inelastic, what I observe is कि inelastic के केस में कंज्यूमर सरप्लस का जो फॉल आ रहा है वो स्लाइटली ज्यादा है as compared to elastic के केस में. Okay? What I teach students is to look at it from two point of views. Okay? एक तो ये है कि for the same price change, like we've done in this case, for the same price change, we can clearly see कि elastic के अंदर जो loss of consumer surplus है वो कम है और inelastic के अंदर जो loss of consumer surplus है वो ज्यादा है. This is when you're comparing for the same price change, when you're comparing elastic में ज्यादा drop आएगा surplus में या inelastic में ज्यादा आएगा. So clearly we can see inelastic में ज्यादा आएगा. But when you compare it to the original, for example, elastic के case में the original was 1, 2, and 3, और elastic के case में 2 और 3 loss हो गया, तो in comparison to the total, elastic में you've lost almost majority of your surplus. लेकिन inelastic के case के अंदर, when price rose and you lost the surplus, it is not the majority of the total consumer surplus. So there are two ways of looking at it. I think in books जो ज्यादातर Bamford ने बात की हुई है, and Bamford should be your primary source, because everything is taken from there, marking schemes are taken from there, questions are coming from the headings of that particular chapter, of the chapters the way it is broken down. So it's your primary source. तो बेस्ड ऑन दैट दिस इज व्हाट्स हैपनिंग. तो उन्होंने जो है ना सेम प्राइस चेंज के अंदर कंपेयर किया है कि देखें इलास्टिक में क्या हो रहा है और इन इलास्टिक में क्या हो रहा है. एंड इन योर आंसर आई थिंक दैट इज वेयर योर डिस्कशन शुड गो आफ्टर दिस पॉइंट, कि आफ्टर you've made the diagram and you've shown supply curve के लेफ्ट शिफ्ट होने की वजह से जो है कंज्यूमर सरप्लस लूज होगा, and then the later part of your essay should be that you're going to talk about कि किस तरीके से for your next mark, that if your PED is elastic, which is greater than 1, right? If it's price elastic, then fall in consumer surplus is lower, or फिर if PED is less than 1, which means you are price inelastic, तो फिर उस केस के अंदर then fall in consumer surplus is higher. But according to the question, what I see is कि दोनों सिनेरियो के अंदर, and I think that should be my evaluative statement after I make the comparison of this. And please, ये मैं बहुत briefly बता रहा हूँ, I would prefer कि आप पूरी ये elasticity के अंदर, you go about the whole thing that if the percentage rise in price is elastic के case में is lesser than the percentage increase in quantity demanded, percentage fall in the quantity demanded. So therefore, consumer surplus is lower, something along that line. If you do that, that would be nicer. Whenever we want to talk about elasticity, it's a must that you talk about the proportion of price change and the proportion of quantity. Not very vague question के अंदर price rise के बारे में है, तो your answer should completely be in terms of price rise. When you do it in terms of price fall, we completely disregard. We don't even read it. Almost, obviously, we read it, but we just write seen next to it because it's irrelevant. There is no marking for it. ठीक है? As far as our
Does
evaluation goes,
PS not matter?
sorry,
Does PS not matter?
PS does not matter. Consumer surplus के अंदर PS does not matter because it's below the demand curve, above the price. So I don't see that it would have any impact. What I've seen is sometimes they do write it in the marking scheme, but even I have trouble कि क्यों लिखी है इन्होंने, because that is so complicated even if you try to do it, because number one, मेरे ख्याल में तो नहीं होता अनलेस के प्रोड्यूसर सरप्लस की बात हुई भी होती, या कोई एक्सपेंडिचर की बात की हुई होती और समथिंग। जब उसने कंज्यूमर सरप्लस बोला है तो पीडी डिटरमिन्स, आई एम जस्ट थिंकिंग कि अगर इलास्टिसिटीज इलास्टिक इन इलास्टिक हो जाए तो क्या मेरे इक्विलिब्रियम को कोई फर्क पड़ जाएगा एज अ रिजल्ट ऑफ दैट। अगेन, it's don't avoid going in that direction. If they're saying consumer surplus, stick with um, the demand curve and PED. If they talk about producer surplus, then talk about PES, avoid PED. ठीक है? And I'll tell you, I think ये November के अंदर they have written that. I haven't seen anything, even in like the practice questions or anything where we might have discussed, or even a single kid have written anything about PES. There might be a way, honestly. That's why examiners, for some reason, placed it there. But let's take a look at this question in just a bit also, what you're talking about. From my evaluative point of view, please remember, evaluation को लिखने से पहले एक दफा फिर question पे जाना बहुत जरूरी है, because are you really answering the question they're saying? Consider whether a rise in the price due to higher cost of production is likely to always reduce consumer surplus. Well, turns out that it seems that yes, you know, in evaluative statement, in all my cases, like whether it is PED is greater than 1 or PED is less than 1, a price rise is causing consumer surplus to fall. It's just a matter of that the size of fall varies, and I will just bring that back. If PED greater than 1 के केस के अंदर there is a smaller fall in comparison to PED less than 1, because मैंने डायग्राम के साथ तुमको शो कर दिया कि दोनों केस के अंदर कंज्यूमर सरप्लस तो गिर रहा है। I can't think of any other instance जिसके अंदर consumer surplus ना गिरे. Whether even if you take demand curve as perfectly inelastic, consumer surplus गिरेगा. If you take it perfectly elastic, consumer surplus होता ही नहीं है, तो उसमें गिरने का कोई सवाल ही नहीं बनता. बाकी हर केस के अंदर it is going to fall, right? So I think that was a much on the this side was a much more simpler thing to do. Um, Otherwise, my supply side say I can't make any connection of this. In fact, I'll show you November's question also. That was such a big mess,
But
such a
sir,
complicated
the
one.
initial part of the question does have reference to PES. So,
It
uh,
doesn't have
and
PS reference.
wait, can you? Oh, wait, producer surplus. It says producer surplus.
I know, but वो जो पहला part है उसमें सिर्फ उन्होंने बोला explain what is meant by consumer surplus and producer surplus. So
But
वो जो weather वाला part है उसमें there's only talking about consumer surplus.
but sir, like, for example, like if there is a mention, don't be connected somehow to producer sur- producer surplus.
Okay. Number one, it is impossible or highly improbable. In fact, let me clarify this whole thing. Let me show you a question जो अभी नवंबर में आया था, which sort of like completely messed up our heads also before the marking scheme was out. Let me upload it. All right, take a look at this question. This was November question, which I was continuously giving reference to. Take a look at this one. This is अभी का question, अभी आया है November में, we're checking right now. November 25, our variant question number 2A. What does it say? With the help of a diagram, explain the difference between producer surplus and consumer surplus and consider the extent to which producers always gain when the price of product increase due to higher cost of production. Now, based on the question that we've just done, what are we supposed to do in this one? How are we supposed to write? क्या करें इसके अंदर? चलो पहला पार्ट जो है वो तो सिंपल सा है, like we just dealt with, that first you're going to make a diagram. So this is how we've graded it. First we want a diagram of it, जिसके अंदर we want the demand curve, supply curve, perfectly labeled demand and supply with the original equilibriums, with the price, consumer surplus marked, producer surplus marked. Simple रखो, कोई complications नहीं होनी चाहिए. We don't want even a write-up जिसके अंदर तुम identify करो. We want you to identify it in the diagram. All right, perfect. We give you 1 mark for this. Okay. Then we give you a mark for the definition. Define consumer surplus, we give you 1 mark. Define producer surplus, we give you 1 mark. Knowledge, understanding, done. Next part. Consider the extent to which producer always gains when the price of the product increases due to higher cost of production. Okay, we attempted this question in the past. So what do we need to do? We need to make a diagram, or we can use the same diagram and we can shift the supply curve to the left. And let's do that. Let me make another curve and let's do that. But this time, remember, it's always about will producer always gain? So do let me know your thoughts. What do you think this question's direction should be? What should we write for this? What producer gain are they talking about? तो पहले तो हमने दिखाया higher cost of production से supply curve shift to the left. Then what happens? The price goes up. What happens? Quantity falls down. अब क्या करें? Okay. Now what will the
Sir,
examiner do? The examiner will give 1 mark for this. Now what?
can we talk about like do we have to mention like inferior goods, like हो सकता है we can connect it from there. If it does, for example, price increases of this particular good producer, this particular
Inferior
producer may.
is only about incomes. You
Okay, so
don't
you
need
won't
to
mention.
bring, yeah, nope. No need to. If price is changing and now they're talking about क्या करना है, I've seen some questions जिसके अंदर, and honestly जब पहली marking scheme भी आई थी pre-standardized, oh, it was a mess. And it was perfect mess because आपका पहला question का पहला part is producer surplus and consumer surplus. So the kid is going to try to make sense कि अच्छा consumer surplus, producer surplus की बात हुई है, अब जब supply curve left पे गया, price ऊपर गई है, producer की बात हो रही है, तो now let's talk about what happened to the producer surplus, which was originally this area right here. अब जब higher cost of production हो गई है, so now what has happened to the new producer surplus because the prices have gone up and quantity has gone down. तो अब नया producer surplus क्या है? वैसे तो जब हम टैक्सेशन पढ़ते हैं तो उस केस के अंदर हम कहते हैं द न्यू प्रोड्यूसर सरप्लस इज दिस एरिया ओवर हियर, बट दैट वाज इन द केस ऑफ टैक्सेशन. इफ a lot of kids what they did was उन्होंने बोला कि यार producer surplus by definition is above the supply curve and below the market price, so P1 is the market price above the supply curve, it should be this is what has happened to producer surplus, it has fallen down. Now economic theory के हिसाब से we've never done this, by the way. We have never taught this in books. We haven't taught anywhere. Kids just mix it up right at that moment. Examiners understood that what have they done is gadbad. So what they preferred, the answer, what the students should do is first mark for the first consumer producer identification, 1 mark for definition, 1 mark for another definition, 1 mark for supply curve shifts to the left, price goes up, quantity falls down. Uske baad, they chose the same route as it depends on the PED, and if the PED was greater than 1 and if this good was price elastic, then the percentage rise in price is less than the percentage fall in quantity demanded. Therefore, producers' revenue will fall. You see how that gain revenue वाली बात perfectly makes sense because वो भी तो है, but exam में कौन आके तुमको बताएगा? So you need to be ready कि sometimes it's not connected to the first part of the question, and if it's inelastic, you have to take that second part in its own face value is much greater than the percentage fall in quantity demanded. So in this case, the revenue fell. अब इसकी मार्किंग स्कीम देखते हैं जरा. मार्किंग स्कीम में इन्होंने क्या किया? टेक अ लुक एट दिस वन हियर. For a correct diagram, effect of higher cost, supply curve shifts to the left, obviously price goes up. Diagram में आपने mark किया है, perfectly we give you 1 mark. Explains the impact on the producer in terms of an increase या fall in revenue if PED is inelastic, 1 mark. If PED is elastic, 1 mark. If the kid has done that, give them the 2 marks, 3 marks completed. But this is the interesting one. The impact may also depend on whether PES is elastic, inelastic, affecting the producer's ability to respond to the price increase. Now, I don't know honestly what that means. I haven't come across any kid who has actually talked about this. They've talked about PEDs. Nobody has talked about PES. If somebody does, then I would spend time and try to understand what this really means. Okay, just for argument's sake, Let's do it. Let's try to figure out what they're saying. So for that, what I need to do is I need to make two absolutely same diagrams जिसमें डिमांड एग्जैक्टली मैं न्यूट्रलाइज कर लेता हूं. Yeah. So let me take two exactly same diagrams and let me see if I can do something with that. एक के अंदर I'll make an inelastic supply curve और दूसरे के अंदर I'll make a highly elastic supply curve. Okay? After that, there is a higher cost of production. So I need to be mindful कि मैं दोनों cases के अंदर मैं जो अपना demand supply curve को shift करूंगा, I'll make sure that I shift my supply curve in exactly the same size. तो vertical distance represents कि आपकी cost of production कितने से ऊपर गई है, by the way. ठीक है? And I'll move this one also by exactly the same size. Okay. Okay. All right. दोनों को मैंने exactly same size से change किया है. सिर्फ और सिर्फ उनको फर्क क्यों नजर आ रहा है? Because one was inelastic and one was elastic. All right. Now, as a result of this, let's see what has happened to our revenues. New equilibrium. Okay. What has happened to my revenue in this case? My original revenue, दोनों cases के अंदर my original revenue is exactly the same because that POQO was copy pasted. But then when supply curve shifted by vertically the same distance, that means same cost, so my new revenues have actually changed. And now we can compare these two blue areas with each other and we can see overall what has happened. In my opinion, overall, the producer's revenue has fallen more in this one and it is higher in this one. But marking scheme is actually not referring to this. If you read closely, PES के case के अंदर, they are referring to the idea कि PES की elastic or inelastic से it would affect the producer's ability to respond to the price increase. So when price increases, elastic के case में if price increases because of higher cost of production, so if it's elastic, producers will be able to respond more greatly. If you notice, elastic के case में क्या हुआ? Because of the higher price, there was a much bigger change that has happened in the quantity. और इसके अंदर inelastic के case में there is a much smaller change in the quantity which has happened. I still don't know कि ये क्या कह रहे हैं इसके अंदर. Why have they added this statement over here? I don't have any clarity on that.
There,
Because
it could be that, for example, when the supply curve is inelastic, we could see that quantity demanded there's a less fall in quantity demanded, right? And when it's elastic and there's like when it's elastic, there's a larger fall in
there's a
quantity
larger
demanded.
fall. Yeah.
So we could say that total revenue would fall less when the supply curve is inelastic in comparison to when it's elastic. So it would give more room for producers to respond.
Sure.
मतलब
Sure. I would not expect this from 99% of the kids. In
no,
fact,
sir, I
I've
would.
checked over 100 and I haven't seen a single answer which takes that into consideration, you know?
I would honestly write about it maybe because considering के question में ऊपर लिखा हुआ है consumer and producer surplus, I would try connect it, but rather than that, I don't think I would maybe go into this much depth.
Yeah, yeah. Honestly, I have a doubt that even the examiner who's checking has the capacity to understand this. Honestly, I don't think he's going to spend so much time in this. He's probably just going to do too vague on it and he's going to move on. Because I know for a fact that बच्चे को समझाने में भी बहुत ही अच्छी sentence structure और English आनी चाहिए for them to be capable of writing a very clear answer for this one. So let's just avoid that approach altogether. ठीक हो गया. अब इसकी जो evaluative statement है, just take a look at the evaluative statement. PD की cases के अंदर evaluation, I think let's be clear कि अब हम क्या कर सकते हैं evaluation के अंदर. Going back to our answer that we're going with this whole idea, 3 mark idhar uthaye, 3 mark elastic and inelastic ke uthaye, and then for your evaluation we have to answer consider the extent to which producer always gains when the product increases due to higher cost. So our final evaluation, what they want is कि देखिए अब आपने elastic and inelastic तो समझा दिया. Okay. Now you can't do a repetition of that. So what they want is evaluation के अंदर maybe a further discussion that जो भी gain होगा that will depend on the value of PD, meaning that how inelastic or how elastic the product is. You understand? We've talked about less than 1, greater than 1. But remember, जब हम लिखते हैं PD लेस देन 1, तो लेस देन 1 के अंदर 0.8 भी आता है और 0.2 भी आता है. 0.8 is less inelastic and 0.2 is more inelastic, right? तो ये वाला जो इलास्टिक होगा ये थोड़ा सा कम इलास्टिक होगा. तो जो रेवेन्यू के ऊपर इम्पैक्ट आएगा वो थोड़ा सा डाइल्यूटेड होगा 0.8 के अंदर, और जो रेवेन्यू पे इम्पैक्ट आएगा हाईली इनइलास्टिक के अंदर वो ज्यादा बड़ा रेवेन्यू में इंक्रीज आएगा. तो जितना ज्यादा स्टीप होगा और लो वैल्यू होगी पीडी की, नियर जीरो होगा, उतना ज्यादा इम्पैक्ट क्रिएट होगा रेवेन्यू पे और प्रोड्यूसर के गेन पे. सो इन सिंपलर वर्ड्स, द मोर नेसेसिटी द गुड इज. इनफैक्ट परफेक्टली इनइलास्टिक के केस में तो कॉस्ट ऑफ प्रोडक्शन बढ़ी, आपने सारा का सारा प्राइस जो है प्रोड्यूसर कंज्यूमर पे डाल दिया एंड योर रेवेन्यू गोज अप बाय द कॉस्ट ऑफ प्रोडक्शन जितने से ऊपर जाएगा. तो और जितना क्लोजर टू 1 आप जा रहे होंगे, 0.8, 0.9, 0.95, 0.99, उतना ज्यादा रेवेन्यू में जो इंक्रीज आएगा वो कम आएगा, इतना ज्यादा इंक्रीज नहीं आएगा. So that is one of the discussions we can have. Remember, when we're checking on evaluation, it needs to be a step forward to what you have already discussed in the analysis. It needs to be a further discussion, a step forward. Otherwise, it's just repetition. You can't get marked for repetition. Okay? So that's that. Let me come to another question. इसी के relevancy के अंदर, and this was actually a 12 marker. Let me take you to that one. Very similar to what we've discussed right now, but it's for 12 marks. So how do we go about a question like this? This is June 23, variant 23. It's not our variant. Question 2 part B. इसका जो first part था इस question का, that was to do with elasticities, right? This is slightly on the independent side. This is a different question. इससे पहले वाला जो था वो income elasticity के ऊपर था, the size and the sign and all of that. We dealt with that in the past. So yeah, let's take a look at this question. Now, before, चलो एक दफा पढ़ लेते हैं पहले. When the price of a product changes, it usually changes the consumer surplus in the market. Okay? Assess how variation in price elasticity of demand for a product determines the extent of changes in consumer surplus in a market. It's a 12 marker. Honestly, जहां तक नजर आ रहा है, it is pretty much similar to what we've already done. But what are we supposed to write for a 12 marker? Considering कि 12 marker की checking तो बहुत ही subjective है. It's not objective the way it was before. इसके अंदर तो क्या हो रहा था? The AO1 and AO2 is combined for 8 marks, and AO3 evaluation is separate for 4 marks, and the answer is in levels, level 1, level 2, and level 3. And evaluation is also in levels, level 1 and level 2. तो अब एग्जामिनर इसको कैसे रीड करेगा? इसके अंदर क्या क्या चीजें होनी चाहिए in order for you to get the highest mark? Now, normally, जब हम क्वेश्चन से डील करते हैं 12 marker, now 23 onwards, you jump directly into the question and you start answering. But I have a feeling in this particular question, there is no way to answer this question without explaining the terms, and they have to give you marks to explain those terms. Normally, they don't. Now, normally they don't, right? Normally, if you have a question, like for example, velocity-based questions that we've had in the past, जिसके अंदर if they ask you a question, again, वही मैं अगर November के question का reference दूं तुमको, the question was about that how in a falling income economy, एक economy है जिसमें incomes are falling down, so how business can use income elasticity and cross elasticity, right? तो अब उसके अंदर kids define the whole idea of income elasticity and cross elasticity, formulas, definitions in a 12 marker. We just write scene next to it and we move on, right? बच्चे ऑलमोस्ट एक एक पेज डेढ़ डेढ़ पेज के अंदर पूरी सारी चीजें लिखते हैं. वैल्यू ग्रेटर देन वन है तो इलास्टिक, लेस देन वन इन इलास्टिक, प्लस है तो नॉर्मल, माइनस है तो इंफीरियर. दे राइटिंग ऑल ऑफ दैट. Zero. We're not giving any mark for that. Why? Because the question is usefulness के हिसाब से बताएं. How can the business use that knowledge? So now you need to make sure when you're writing your answer, you use that knowledge somehow. So यहाँ पे how would I answer this? I would go into the basics and I would answer in the basic way. I don't know any other way that I can answer this question, honestly. So this is what I would do. I would define consumer surplus because there is no other way that I can move forward with this question, whether they give you mark for it or not. Would I do the diagram? I don't know, you know, but there's no harm in doing it.
Sir,
ये
does the
मैं
marking scheme say that is there a mark for defining
well, whether
CS
it
in the
says
beginning?
or no, you don't know, right? You don't know. Honestly, when you're dealing with a question, I would like you to, even when you're prepping, you don't know what the marking scheme says. And trust me when I say this, marking scheme varies. तो फिर क्या करोगे? तो what you want to do is you want to make sure that, you know, whatever your gut is saying, put everything out there, whatever you can. So I would want to make the diagram also, just in case. वैसे तो if they don't ask for a diagram, there is no mark for a diagram. 100%. That I can tell you for sure, Richie,
Right,
that if they haven't asked for a diagram, there is no mark for diagram. You cannot be penalized for not making a diagram. Okay?
right, sir.
So you define the consumer surplus, you make a diagram for it. Then they're not telling you कि price rise हो रहा है कि price fall हो रहा है. They're just simply saying price change हो रहा है. ठीक हो गया? So now that they're saying कि सिर्फ price change हो रहा है, so then let's answer accordingly कि price change हो रहा है. So how do I deal with that? तो price change के अंदर, give me one second. Yeah. So this is what I'll do. I'll do both. I'll say that if price rises, consumer surplus falls. I'll make a diagram and I'll prove it. This is my original, बल्कि in fact पहले में ही prove कर सकते हो, दूसरा मर्जी है क्योंकि 12 mark है तो I would like to do my detailing on it. That if the price rises, consumer surplus has fallen down. Let me do that same thing, area 1, 2, 3. Pehle, your consumer surplus was the entire area 1, 2, 3. Now your consumer surplus is only area 1. So yes, if price rises, consumer surplus falls. Okay. If price falls, consumer surplus rises. You can do that in the diagram and you can show that कि देखें the price गिरी, so your consumer surplus actually rose by this area 2 and 3 also. So because of the fall in the price, consumer surplus actually went up. So I covered both sides of my answer. Whenever they use the word change and they're not telling you whether the price is rising or falling, be safe, do both sides. Don't leave any doubt whatsoever. फिर उसके बाद question नीचे says that assess how variations in price elasticity of demand for a product determines the extent of changes in consumer price and all. Okay, now this is what I'll do next. Now that I've defined CES, why not define PED also? That it measures the responsiveness in quantity demanded due to change in price. Then I would like to explain what do I mean by price inelastic and how the value is less than 1. And I'll do the diagram. And I'll show inelastic का case. अब इसमें भी मैं price rise और price fall दोनों दिखाऊं? That's ridiculous. But I'll do it anyways. Inelastic के case में I'll show if the price rises, there is a fall in the consumer surplus. Okay. But remember मैंने एक डायग्राम बनाया था जिसमें मैंने इलास्टिक को भी डाला था and I showed in comparison जो अभी हमने किया था एक 8 मार्कर के अंदर. Let's do that. I think that gives a better comparison. कि इन इलास्टिक के केस में and इलास्टिक के केस के अंदर if PED is greater than 1 तो फिर उसके अंदर क्या होगा in comparison if price is rising elastic के केस के अंदर there is a smaller fall in consumer surplus than in elastic के केस के अंदर. Right? We've already done that. So I'm going to do that whole thing again with diagram to make sure that I have, explained the whole thing. आपने individually करना है, आप individually करें because remember to get the highest mark you need to make sure that you cover every single thing and read the question over and over again that assess how variations in price elasticity. तो ये दो variation हो गई जो हमने करके देख ली. Should we go into perfectly elastic and elastic? I don't think so. I think इतना तो वो तुमको levy दे देंगे कि नहीं यार जरूरी नहीं है. Should we do for a price fall? If you can do it, do it. But I think that's pretty reasonable that what we've done so far is fine. लेकिन प्राइस फॉल के साथ भी अगर कर सकते हो तो डू दैट उसमें ऑब्वियसली कंज्यूमर इसी को देख लो ना इसी डायग्राम को देख लो और एंड जस्ट इमेजिन इफ PO वाज द प्राइस एंड इट फेल टू P1 तो जब प्राइस गिरेगी तो दिस इज द गेन इन कंज्यूमर सरप्लस और इन इलास्टिक में दिस इज द गेन सो क्लियरली इफ द प्राइसेस फॉल डाउन इन इलास्टिक के अंदर गेन ज्यादा है लॉस के कंपैरेटिवली तो आप इसकी यू मेजरमेंट के हिसाब से आप देख सकते हैं एंड यू कैन डू इट थ्रू द डायग्राम आप वर्बली भी लिख लें कोई मसला नहीं है. नाउ आई थिंक दैट शुड कवर द होल थिंग. फिर इसका जब हम इवैल्यूएशन करेंगे तो व्हाट डू वी नीड टू राइट अबाउट, क्योंकि how variation in price determines the extent of change in the consumer surplus. I think in evaluation, what they want is, in evaluation, they would want a discussion on the size of price change, because we did not talk about that, by the way. Let me go back. What am I talking about here? You know how we said price fall say consumer surplus में gain आएगा? What if I had shifted this price a lot more? Or if I had just shifted by just a little? तो फिर कंज्यूमर सरप्लस की गेन को क्या हो जाता? दिस एरिया 2-3, इफ देयर वाज अ बिगर फॉल इन द प्राइस, एरिया 2-3 ज्यादा बड़ा होता. इफ देयर वाज अ स्मॉलर फॉल इन द प्राइस, 2 और 3 कम होता. सिमिलरली, इफ आई रोज द प्राइस बाय अ लॉट, एरिया 2-3 ज्यादा बड़ा सरप्लस लॉस हो जाता, और छोटा ड्रॉप करते तो छोटा आता. तो फर्स्ट थिंग is about the size. So the smaller size leads to smaller change, while larger size of price change leads to larger change in consumer surplus. Basically, consumer surplus की बात हो रही है, right? So this is what we would have written. उसके अलावा क्योंकि वैल्यूएशन 4 मार्क की है, तो सिर्फ इससे तो 2 ही मार्क मिल सकते हैं तुमको मैक्सिमम अच्छे से लिखने के लिए. तो इवैल्यूएशन के अंदर the other thing that we can always write about is, you know how they said PED, तो how about value of PD कर लो इसको. तो more inelastic PED, greater the fall in consumer surplus. वही वाली बात, 0.8 versus 0.2, right? And more elastic PED, smaller fall in consumer surplus. Now you can make the diagrams and you can look at it theoretically, what I mean by that. ठीक है? It's a very strange question, by the way. 2023 के हिसाब से जो regular आपका question होता है 12 mark का, उसके हिसाब से this question is very off the way usually a 12 marker is structured. I think कोई recent के अंदर तो I can't think of any questions which may have.
Yeah, sir, that was what I was about to ask you, because usually 12 marker mein they give you two things where you're supposed to be like advantages and disadvantages of
Yeah,
both the things. And like this was so different from like that.
yeah. But again, ये 2023 का था, तो that's why I would say, or I would give them a little, you know, let me on that. You know what? They were also trying to figure out कि किस तरीके के questions बन सकते हैं. But yeah, so that's how we can deal with these questions. Okay.